My name is Harper. I'm 38 years old, and until recently, I would have described myself as ordinary in the most comfortable way. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work as a project coordinator for a mid-sized architectural firm. I color code spreadsheets. I remember birthdays. I keep the pantry organized by category. If you met me at a dinner party, you'd probably say I seem calm, polite, maybe a little reserved. I'm the woman refilling water glasses while everyone else debates politics. The one who notices when someone hasn't been included in the conversation and quietly shifts the chair so they feel seen. What most people don't realize is that calm doesn't mean unaware. For 12 years, I was married to a man everyone admired. Ethan was charming in a way that made people lean in. He had a quick laugh, an easy handshake, and a talent for telling stories that made even grocery shopping sound like an adventure. We were, from the outside, steady, solid. The couple who hosted Thanksgiving, the couple who never seemed to fight in public. But here is the sentence that changed everything. I discovered my husband had been living a double life for years, right under my roof. 2 phones, 2 schedules, 2 versions of the same man. The first time I held both of those phones in my hands, I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't even cry. I remember noticing their weight, how similar they felt. Identical cases, identical fingerprints, as if duplicity could be disguised as symmetry. This isn't a story about explosive revenge or dramatic confrontations in parking lots. There were no scenes worthy of a tabloid headline. What happened was quieter than that, slower, more deliberate. This is a story about perception, about how easily someone can be underestimated when they don't raise their voice, about what it means to watch, to document, to understand, before you ever speak. It's also about the version of myself I had to confront. The woman who sensed small inconsistencies and chose comfort over clarity. The woman who told herself that loyalty meant patience, even when patience was being misused. I won't pretend I handled everything perfectly. I won't pretend I wasn't hurt. But I can promise you this. I chose honesty over spectacle, precision over chaos, silence over accusation, until silence became strategy. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you exactly how I pieced it together. Not just what he did, but how I changed. How invisibility can become leverage. How stillness can become power. And maybe, as you listen, you'll ask yourself something I had to learn the hard way. Have you ever mistaken your own intuition for overthinking, just because someone else seemed more confident than you? If you asked my husband who I was, before everything unraveled, he would have smiled and said, "Harper keeps our world running." It sounded like praise, and for a long time I accepted it as such. To our friends, I was the reliable one. The woman who remembered everyone's dietary restrictions. The one who sent thank you cards without being reminded. If a trip was planned, I booked the flights. If a bill was due, I paid it early. If someone needed advice, I listened longer than anyone else in the room. Reliability is a beautiful trait. It's also very easy to take for granted. Ethan was the charismatic one. At gatherings, he told stories about his latest projects, about clients who couldn't make decisions without him, about deals that only closed because of his negotiation skills. I stood beside him, refilling wine glasses, laughing at the right moments. People would say, "You're so lucky, Harper. He's incredible." And I would nod. What they didn't see was the quiet infrastructure beneath his confidence. The calendar I maintained, the invoices I double-checked, the gentle reminders I sent him before meetings so he never forgot an anniversary, a birthday, or a deadline. If he looked thoughtful and prepared, it was often because I had prepared him, but I never corrected the narrative. There's a specific kind of woman society rewards. Agreeable, steady, unthreatening. I had mastered that role early in life. Growing up, I learned that asking too many questions created tension. Challenging someone's story made me difficult. So I adapted. I observed. I anticipated. I made myself useful. Being useful felt safer than being seen. At work, it was similar. My boss once introduced me to a new client as the glue that keeps us organized. Not the strategist, not the visionary, the glue. Necessary but invisible. I told myself I preferred it that way. In marriage, that invisibility deepened into something more subtle. Ethan handled the big picture. I handled the details. He talked about future investments. I quietly tracked our accounts. He took credit for the vacations we enjoyed. I researched and booked every element. When something went wrong, a missed reservation, a late payment, he would say lightly, "Harper, you're slipping." It was always a joke, delivered with a grin. But the room would look at me, not him. I laughed along. The truth is, I was proud of how much I could carry without complaint. I believed endurance was a form of love. If I absorbed the small inconveniences, the tiny dismissals, then the marriage would stay smooth. Stability, I thought, required someone willing to bend. And I bent gracefully. When Ethan started coming home later than usual, I didn't question it publicly. When he stepped outside to take calls, I turned up the television so he could have privacy. When he said work was stressful, I made his favorite dinner. From the outside, I looked like the ideal partner. Supportive, calm, never accusatory. Inside, I was cataloging things I couldn't yet explain. The way his stories began to loop, as if rehearsed. The way he'd answer questions was slightly adjacent to what I asked. The way his gratitude toward me started to sound rehearsed too. I don't know what I'd do without you. As though appreciation could replace presence. But here's what matters. At that point, I didn't suspect a double life. I suspected distance. And distance is easier to excuse. Everyone around us saw a successful man and a steady wife. They saw balance. They saw a partnership that worked because I didn't make waves. What they didn't understand, and what I hadn't fully admitted to myself, was that invisibility has a cost. When people get used to you carrying everything quietly, they stop checking how heavy it is. And when someone believes you will never challenge them, they begin to test that assumption. I wasn't weak. I wasn't naive. I was watching. I just hadn't decided yet what I was watching for. Looking back, I can trace the beginning to something so small most people would have missed it. It wasn't a lipstick stain. It wasn't a late-night confession. It wasn't even one of the phones. It was a Thursday in October. Ethan and I were at a dinner party hosted by one of his colleagues. There were 12 of us around a long wooden table, candles flickering, the kind of setting that makes everything feel intimate and curated. The conversation drifted from politics to travel to work. At some point, someone asked how Ethan managed to balance such a demanding schedule. He laughed lightly and said, "You just have to be disciplined. I keep everything in my head. If you rely too much on planners or reminders, you lose your edge." There was a pause. Someone at the table glanced at me. They all knew I lived by my planner. It wasn't a secret. Ethan knew it too, better than anyone. I smiled. It would have been easy for him to say, "Harper keeps us organized." That would have been true. Instead, he continued, "Harper's sweet, but she worries too much. I try to tell her not to overthink everything." The table chuckled. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a small cut, the kind that doesn't bleed immediately. I felt it in my chest, not as anger, but as confusion. The narrative he had just created erased my contribution and reframed my strength as a flaw. Organized became anxious. Prepared became overthinking. And he did it so smoothly. On the drive home, I said lightly, "I didn't realize you felt that way about my planner." He shrugged, eyes still on the road. "Oh, come on. It was a joke. Don't be sensitive." There it was. Not the dismissal itself, but the reframing of my reaction as the problem. I told myself he was right. It was small. It was harmless. No marriage survives if you dissect every offhand comment. But something inside me didn't settle. In the weeks that followed, I began noticing subtle patterns. When friends complimented him, he accepted it fully. When they complimented me, he redirected it. "She just likes staying busy. She gets stressed if she doesn't have control. She'd probably track my breathing if she could." Always with a smile. Always wrapped in humor. Always deniable. If I had protested, I would have looked dramatic. So I didn't. That's the tricky thing about the first small cut. It teaches you what your silence costs, and what speaking up might cost more. Then came the first real inconsistency. Ethan told me he had a client dinner on a Tuesday night. It wasn't unusual. He texted around 9:30 p.m. saying it was running long. I believed him. I didn't check. I didn't question. But when he came home, there was a faint detail that didn't match the story. He smelled like a different cologne, not strongly, just enough for someone who has folded his laundry for 12 years to notice. When I asked casually, "Did you change colognes?" He paused half a second too long. "No, why would I? It just smells different." "You're imagining it, Harp." Imagining it. Another small cut. I could have pressed further. Instead, I smiled and said, "Must be me." That night, lying beside him, I replayed the dinner party in my mind. The way he had shaped the room's perception of me. The way he had gently suggested I was prone to overthinking. If a person tells you often enough that you're too sensitive, you start pre-editing your own instincts. So I told myself I was being dramatic. It was just a joke, just a scent, just stress from work. But something had shifted. Not in him. In me. The first small cut didn't make me suspicious. It made me attentive. Because I realized something subtle and unsettling. The person who benefits most from you doubting yourself will always encourage you to do exactly that. And from that night on, I began to listen. Not just to what he said, but to what didn't quite align. Quietly. Without accusation. Without drama. Just observation. There's a phase in any slow unraveling where nothing is dramatic enough to justify alarm. It's just repetitive. After the dinner party, after the cologne, life continued exactly as it always had. We hosted friends. We attended family birthdays. We posted smiling photos on holiday. If you looked at us from the outside, you would have seen stability. Inside that stability, something quieter was happening. Ethan began correcting me more often in public. Small things. If I told a story about a trip we took, he'd interrupt gently. "That's not exactly how it happened." If I mentioned a date, he'd adjust it. "No, that was Wednesday, not Thursday." If I shared an opinion about a restaurant or a movie, he'd smile and say, "Harper has very specific tastes. You can't always trust her reviews." Each moment, on its own, was harmless, even playful. But over time, the pattern created something subtle. A narrative where I was slightly unreliable, slightly emotional, slightly mistaken. And because it was always delivered with humor, anyone who challenged it would look humorless. I began pre-editing myself before speaking, double-checking dates in my head, softening my opinions, adding disclaimers like, "I could be wrong, but," even when I knew I wasn't. It's strange how easily you can shrink without noticing. At home, he became harder to pin down. His schedule shifted in ways that were explainable, but irregular. Late meetings, early breakfasts, weekend client emergencies. When I asked questions, his answers were smooth but slightly imprecise. Just the usual. Nothing interesting. You wouldn't know them. I told myself that demanding details would make me seem insecure. And here's the part that's hardest to admit. I started rationalizing his distance as ambition. He's building something. He's under pressure. He needs space. Every time my intuition nudged me, I countered it with logic. Marriage requires trust. Marriage requires flexibility. Marriage requires not assuming the worst. What I didn't realize then was that trust is not the same as silence. One night, we were sitting on the couch. He was scrolling through his phone, angled slightly away from me. I noticed he'd started keeping it face down when not in use. It wasn't dramatic, just different. "Busy?" I asked lightly. "Yeah, work stuff." "You seem swamped lately." He exhaled, a controlled sigh. "I'm doing this for us, you know." For us. That phrase is powerful. It turns any discomfort into sacrifice. Any question about ingratitude, so I nodded. "I know, but something inside me registered the shift." His tone wasn't partnership. It was defense. The most subtle change came in how he responded to my calmness. In the past, my steadiness had comforted him. Now, it seemed to irritate him. If I didn't react emotionally, he would push slightly further, teasing me about being predictable, joking that I was too steady to ever surprise anyone. At first, I laughed. Then I noticed something. The more composed I remained, the more he seemed to test it. It was as if my quiet strength no longer served him. It had become an inconvenience. And still, I stayed quiet. Not because I was weak, because I was gathering data. There's a difference between normalizing disrespect and observing it. At the time, I thought I was doing the first. I told myself this was what long marriages look like. Familiarity, friction, small misunderstandings. But late at night, when the house was silent, I would replay conversations in my mind. Not emotionally, analytically. What exactly did he say? What exactly did I feel? What changed in the room? Patterns began forming, not enough to accuse, not enough to confront, but enough to notice that something was being rewritten. Not just his schedule, my identity. I was becoming the anxious wife in subtle jokes, the overly organized partner, the one who worried too much, the one who imagined things. And the more that narrative circulated, the safer he became inside it. Because if I ever questioned something serious, the groundwork had already been laid. She overthinks, she worries, she's sensitive. That's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not with shouting, not with betrayal caught in the act, but with repetition. And somewhere in the repetition, I stopped asking myself whether I was overreacting and started asking a different question. Why does he need me to doubt myself? There's a moment in any long relationship when you realize you're no longer just yourself. You're a role. For years, I thought the role I played was chosen. The steady wife, the organized one, the emotional regulator of the household. It felt natural because it aligned with my strengths. I liked the structure. I liked clarity. I liked knowing where things stood. But sometime during Ethan's subtle shift, I began to see that the role had hardened into something narrower, reliable, useful, invisible. It happened gradually. When friends needed advice about their relationships, they came to me, not to Ethan. When someone forgot a birthday, they apologized to me. When family gatherings were planned, relatives would text me for confirmation, even if Ethan had offered to handle it. I was the administrator of our shared life, and Ethan, he was the face. At first, I didn't resent that dynamic. It felt efficient. We each had strengths. But once I started noticing his public reframing of me, too organized, too anxious, too sensitive, I saw how the role was being edited. He needed me to be dependable. He didn't need me discerning. He needed me calm. He didn't need me questioning. There's a difference. One Saturday afternoon, we were at his parents' house. His mother was talking about a vacation she and his father were planning. She turned to Ethan and said, "You're so good at managing everything. I don't know how you juggle it all." Before I could respond, he smiled and said, "I learned from watching Dad. Harper just keeps me from missing flights." It was light, easy, delivered with a grin. But it was inaccurate. I didn't just keep him from missing flights. I managed our shared accounts. I reviewed contracts when he asked for a second set of eyes. I noticed discrepancies before they became problems. I was more than logistics. But I didn't correct him, because correcting him would disrupt the room. And disrupting the room was not the role I'd been assigned. Later that evening, as we drove home, I asked gently, "Why do you always downplay what I do?" He kept his eyes on the road. "I don't. You're reading into things again." Again. That word. It implied a pattern of overinterpretation, a flaw in my perception. The role was solidifying. Harper, the overreader of situations. What he didn't know was that I had started tracking something new, not on paper, but mentally. Every time he redirected credit. Every time he reframed my strengths as quirks. Every time he suggested, my instincts were exaggerated. It wasn't about ego. It was about narrative control. If you define someone as overly sensitive long enough, then when they finally speak about something serious, the room hesitates before believing them. And here's what I realized one quiet night while flipping through my leather-bound planner. I had accepted a role that required me to minimize myself for the sake of harmony. Not because I lacked strength, but because I valued stability more than recognition. The problem was, stability without truth isn't stability. It's suspension. I began to see how useful my invisibility was to him. A wife who doesn't challenge inconsistencies. A partner who absorbs discomfort privately. A woman who protects the image of marriage at all costs. It created space, and I was starting to suspect he was using that space. But I didn't confront him. Not yet. Because I understood something essential. The moment you step out of a role people depend on, they react. And if I was going to step out of mine, I needed to be certain. So I kept playing it. The reliable one, the calm one, the predictable one, while quietly asking myself a question that felt heavier each day. If he believes I will never challenge the story he's building, what is he building it for? There wasn't a dramatic discovery. No message was lighting up the screen with a name I didn't recognize. No stranger at the door. No receipt falling out of his jacket pocket. The shift happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Ethan had left early, before sunrise. He kissed my forehead lightly, the way he always did, and said he had a breakfast meeting across town. I remember hearing the garage door close and feeling nothing unusual. I made coffee, opened my planner, reviewed the week, and then I saw it. A charge on our shared credit card account. Not large, not alarming. A boutique hotel downtown. Mid-range. Clean. Discreet. Dated 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks ago, he had told me he was at a late client dinner that ended near midnight. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. There are moments when your mind rushes to protect you. It offers alternatives. Maybe it was a meeting space rental. Maybe he booked it for a colleague. Maybe there's a logical explanation. I almost closed the tab. Instead, I checked the timestamp. Check-in, 6:12 p.m. Room service, 9:47 p.m. My memory replayed that night. He had texted me at 9:30 saying the restaurant was loud and he'd call later. He never called. He came home just after midnight. I didn't feel rage. I felt alignment, like two puzzle pieces that had been sitting separately in my mind. They finally clicked together. The cologne, the schedule shifts, the subtle reframing of me as overthinking. I closed the laptop slowly. For the first time, I didn't rush to defend him in my head. I didn't create alternate explanations. I just let the possibility sit there, and something inside me became very still. That stillness was new. It wasn't panic. It wasn't heartbreak. It was clarity without proof. I went about my day normally. Answered emails, attended meetings, smiled at colleagues. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. I was no longer trying to preserve the image of our marriage in my mind. I was trying to understand it. That evening, when Ethan came home, I watched him differently. Not with suspicion, with neutrality. I noticed the rhythm of his movements. How he placed his keys in the same bowl every night. How he washed his hands before asking about my day. How his phone buzzed once, briefly, and he flipped it over without checking it. Small details. He kissed my cheek. Long day. I bet, I said. And in that moment, I realized something quietly profound. If there was another life, he had been living it alongside me seamlessly, calmly, without visible strain. That required planning, discipline, intention, which meant this wasn't impulsive. It was structured, and structure is something I understand deeply. That night, lying in bed beside him, I didn't confront him. I didn't search his phone. I didn't cry. I asked myself a different question. If this is true, if there is more than one version of my husband, what kind of woman do I want to be next? The old version of me would have demanded reassurance, would have presented the charge and waited for an explanation. But the shift inside me whispered something else. Observe first, confirm quietly, act precisely. Because if he were capable of maintaining two narratives, then walking in unprepared would only give him time to construct a third. And for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't interested in being reassured. I was interested in being certain. That Tuesday morning didn't explode my world. It recalibrated it. I stopped being the wife who managed the logistics. I became the woman who studied architecture. Once you suspect something irreversible, silence feels different. Before, my quietness had been a habit, a reflex shaped by years of keeping the peace. But after the hotel charge, silence was no longer passive. It was deliberate. I didn't bring up the charge. I didn't hint. I didn't ask leading questions. Instead, I did something far more unsettling. I behaved exactly as I always had. I packed his lunches. I reminded him about his mother's birthday. I updated our shared calendar. And I watched. When you stop reacting emotionally, people reveal more than they intend to. Ethan seemed relaxed, comfortable. He joked about work stress, about incompetent clients, about how lucky he was to have such a stable home base. He used that phrase twice in 1 week. Stable home base. I began noticing how carefully he separated compartments. His work bag stayed zipped when he wasn't using it. His phone is charged on his side of the bed now, not between us. He had started taking calls outside so he wouldn't disturb me. Each adjustment was subtle enough to defend, but collectively, they formed a structure. 2 schedules, 2 rhythms, 2 versions of availability. One night, he mentioned a conference he needed to attend out of town. 3 days. He sounded almost rehearsed when explaining it, mentioning names, locations, and expected return times before I could ask. I nodded, as if none of it struck me as overly prepared. The older version of me might have asked for reassurance. Instead, I asked for details. Which hotel are you staying at? He hesitated just slightly before answering. Not sure yet. They usually book it for us. That was interesting. Ethan liked control. He booked his own flights, compared prices obsessively. The idea that he'd surrender hotel details to someone else didn't fit. I smiled gently. Send me the address when you get it, just in case. Of course, he said quickly. Silence isn't just the absence of noise. It's space. And I realized something powerful during that week. He was relying on my predictability. In my established role as the non-confrontational partner, the woman who would rather internalize discomfort than disrupt equilibrium. The more composed I appeared, the more confident he became, which meant he would get careless. I didn't need to accuse him. I needed him to be comfortable. That realization changed my posture entirely. I stopped analyzing his tone for affection, stopped measuring his eye contact for guilt. Instead, I began cataloging logistics, departure times, payment methods, unexplained calendar gaps. I reopened the credit card statement from 3 weeks earlier and looked at it again, not as a wife, but as a coordinator. I cross-referenced that date with his client dinner, with his location history shared on our joint app. The location had been turned off that evening. Just that evening. Interesting. Still, I didn't confront him, because confrontation invites defense. And defense creates smoke. I wanted visibility. During his supposed conference, I maintained routine. Texted him good morning. Asked about sessions. He responded promptly, but always slightly delayed. Long enough to suggest he was managing something else in between. On the second night, I checked our shared account again. Another boutique hotel charge. Different location. Same city. That was when the phrase settled fully into my mind. 2 phones, 2 schedules, 2 versions of the same man. I didn't yet have proof of the second phone, but I felt its presence. The precision required to sustain this rhythm implied backup systems. Redundancy. That's how you build something you don't want discovered. Strangely, I didn't feel devastated. I felt strategic. Silence was no longer my coping mechanism. It was my positioning. Because if Ethan believed I was unaware, he would continue operating exactly as he had. And the longer he operated, the clearer the pattern would become. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't trying to maintain harmony. I was mapping the structure, and I understood something with chilling clarity. The person who thinks you're weakest is often the least prepared for your quietest move. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. After the second hotel charge, I stopped looking for emotional confirmation and started building a framework. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted accuracy. If my life was going to change, it would change on facts, not suspicions. The first thing I did was separate my perspective from my feelings. Every time I felt a flicker of hurt, I wrote down the observable detail instead. Not, he doesn't love me anymore, but hotel charges at 6:12 p.m. Location services disabled. The conference story is inconsistent. My leather-bound planner, once filled with grocery lists and project deadlines, began holding something else. Dates, times, inconsistencies. No accusations, just records. I also did something Ethan never would have expected. I revisited our finances, not emotionally, analytically. For years, I had managed our budgeting software. I paid our mortgage, tracked investments, and balanced retirement contributions. Ethan liked the results, but he didn't like the process. He trusted me with it because it bored him. That trust was leverage. I pulled up the last 3 years of statements and looked for patterns. Not just hotel charges, but duplicated expenses. Subscriptions that didn't align with our household. Rideshare receipts in neighborhoods he never mentioned visiting. And slowly, the pattern emerged. He wasn't sloppy. He was consistent. The same boutique hotels, the same days of the week. Mostly Tuesdays and Thursdays. Gaps of 3 to 4 weeks between visits. Not random, scheduled. That was when I understood this wasn't a recent mistake. This was a parallel structure, 2 schedules running side by side. I didn't cry when that realization settled in. I sat very still at the dining table, laptop open, cursor blinking, and felt something colder than sadness. Respect, not admiration, respect for the complexity. To maintain something like this for years required planning, which meant he believed the risk was manageable. He believed I would never look. That assumption was the most revealing detail of all. Over the next month, I made quiet adjustments. I opened a separate savings account in my name only. Not to hide money, but to protect liquidity if I needed it. I updated passwords to accounts that I managed. I printed statements and stored them in a neutral folder labeled Tax Prep. At work, I scheduled a consultation with a financial advisor, not about divorce, about asset allocation, framed as routine planning. I asked questions about liquidity in long-term investments, about exit penalties, about timing. I also began something subtler. I stopped cushioning him socially. When friends praised his work ethic, I didn't add context. When his mother complimented his time management, I didn't reinforce it. I simply let the statement stand alone. It was a small withdrawal of reinforcement. No one noticed, including him. During this time, I paid attention to his devices. He had become more protective of his phone. But one evening, as he showered, I noticed something I hadn't before. His gym bag was slightly heavier than usual. Inside the side pocket, beneath a rolled towel, was another phone. Powered off. Identical case. I didn't touch it. I didn't turn it on. I didn't need to. The existence was enough. 2 phones. Confirmation without confrontation. I closed the bag gently and returned it exactly as it was. That night, when he came to bed and wrapped an arm around me, I felt the physical reality of what I now knew. He had built an entire additional narrative and believed it was stable. What he never noticed during those months was this. I stopped reacting to affection as reassurance. I stopped seeking emotional clarity. I stopped trying to decode his tone. Instead, I was calculating the timeline. If I chose to leave, when would be most strategic? If I confronted him, what documentation would I need? If this went legal, what mattered? Preparation is not anger. It's self-respect expressed through structure. He thought my silence meant denial. In truth, it meant I was repositioning. And the most dangerous thing about someone quiet isn't that they're unaware. It's when they finally move that they've already thought 10 steps ahead. Finding the second phone confirmed the structure, but it didn't yet reveal the scale. For weeks after that discovery, I carried the knowledge like a sealed envelope in my pocket. I didn't open it immediately, not because I was afraid of what I'd see, but because timing matters. Emotionally charged decisions are rarely precise. One evening, Ethan fell asleep unusually early on the couch. He had returned from one of his late client dinners, showered quickly, and claimed exhaustion. His gym bag rested near the entryway, slightly unzipped. The house was quiet. I moved slowly, not dramatically, not furtively, just calmly. I took the second phone from the bag and sat at the dining table, powered off. When I turned it on, there was no passcode. That was the first revelation. He had protected the device physically, but not digitally, as if the real security relied on my assumed disinterest. The screen lit up with a different wallpaper than his primary phone. A photo of a skyline, not our city. Messages populated almost instantly. One name appeared repeatedly. Clara. No hearts, no overtly romantic emojis, just coordination. Landing at 4. Same place? Missed you Tuesday. Next month confirmed. Efficient, structured, scheduled. My hands didn't shake. My breathing didn't quicken. I read like an analyst reviewing correspondence. Photos were minimal. Conversations were tidy. There was no emotional overflow. No dramatic declarations of love. That was the second revelation. This wasn't reckless passion. It was maintenance. Scrolling further back, I saw timestamps extending nearly 3 years. 3 years. Parallel to birthdays we celebrated, holidays we hosted, anniversaries we toasted. I opened the calendar app on the second phone. Color-coded blocks filled the screen. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Conference weekends. Pre-labeled. The synchronization between both of his lives was meticulous. He had engineered spacing, ensuring that one version of him never overlapped visibly with the other. 2 schedules, 2 systems, 2 identities calibrated to avoid collision. I placed the phone back on the table and leaned back in my chair. For a moment, I let the emotional reality approach. Not the betrayal itself, but the duration. 3 years meant intention renewed repeatedly. Choice reaffirmed dozens, maybe hundreds of times. And here's what surprised me most. I didn't feel replaced. I felt reclassified. In his architecture, I was the foundation. Stable, permanent, predictable. She was the variable. That understanding didn't break me. It clarified hierarchy. He had not left because he wanted something better. He had added because he believed he could sustain both. That belief relied entirely on one assumption. Harper will never look. I powered off the second phone and returned it exactly where I'd found it. I did not take screenshots. I did not forward messages. I did not confront him that night. Because the private reveal wasn't about catching him. It was about confirming leverage. I now knew duration, frequency, financial overlap, device redundancy, intentional scheduling. This wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was documentation. When Ethan woke later and joined me in the kitchen, he kissed my temple lightly. "You're quiet tonight." "Just thinking," I said. "About what?" I met his eyes calmly. "Structure." He smiled, not understanding. And in that moment, I realized something subtle but decisive. The power in this situation had shifted. Not because I exposed him, not because I threatened him, but because I was the only person in the room who now understood the full architecture. And when you understand the structure, you don't need to shout. You decide when to dismantle it. Once you see the full structure, you can't unsee it. For a few days after discovering everything on the second phone, I moved through the house with a strange dual awareness. Outwardly, nothing had changed. I still made coffee in the mornings, still asked about his meetings, still folded his shirts with the same precise corners. Internally, I was standing at a crossroads. There were multiple paths available to me. I could confront him immediately, place the second phone on the table and watch his expression fracture. I could contact Clara, introduce myself calmly and observe how she responded. I could ignore it, continue the marriage with adjusted expectations, preserving comfort at the expense of truth. Each option had a different cost. Confrontation would give him time to reshape the narrative. He was skilled at reframing, skilled at softening edges. I had seen that for years. Contacting her would entangle me emotionally in something I didn't need. Ignoring it would mean consenting silently. None of those felt aligned with who I was becoming. So I asked myself a harder question. If I remove emotion entirely, what outcome preserves my dignity long term? The answer arrived without drama. I would leave. Not explosively, not reactively, but irreversibly. The moment I admitted that to myself, something inside me steadied. Leaving didn't mean I hated him. It meant I respected myself. I didn't want to compete with another life. I didn't want to negotiate for transparency. I didn't want to live in a structure built on calculated omission. I wanted coherence. The decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by incompatibility with deception. But deciding internally is different from executing externally. Divorce isn't just emotional, it's logistical. Assets, timelines, legalities, public perception. And Ethan had spent 3 years assuming stability. That assumption would be his blind spot. I began outlining next steps in the same planner he once teased me for using. Quiet legal consultation, asset inventory verification, secure personal funds, identify housing options, choose timing strategically. I didn't rush. Timing mattered. If I acted too quickly, I would operate from emotion. If I waited too long, I risked losing clarity. 2 weeks after the discovery, Ethan mentioned another upcoming conference. 3 days. Out of town. I nodded thoughtfully. "That's good," I said. "You've been working hard." He looked relieved. Relieved. That subtle relief told me everything. He believed the structure was intact. That was when I chose my timing. While he attended his conference, likely splitting time between professional sessions and private arrangements, I would meet with an attorney. I would bring printed financial records. I would understand my options before he ever realized there was a question. The decision felt less like a breakup and more like a project plan. Not because I was detached, but because chaos benefits the person who caused it. Precision benefits the person who observed it. On the night before he left for his trip, he wrapped his arms around me in bed. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he murmured. For the first time, I didn't interpret that as affection. I interpreted it as reliance, and I realized something quietly definitive. He truly didn't know what he would do without me, because he had never considered that possibility. As he slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and let the final layer of hesitation dissolve. This wasn't about exposing him. It wasn't about humiliating him. It wasn't even about Clara. It was about alignment. I could not remain in a life where I was foundational, but not fully chosen. The irreversible option was the only honest one, and once I chose it, I felt something unexpected, not heartbreak, relief. The morning Ethan left for his conference, I stood at the doorway and kissed him goodbye like I always did. "Text me when you land," I said. "Of course," he replied easily, rolling his suitcase toward the car. There was no tremor in my voice, no dramatic pause, just routine. As soon as the garage door closed, I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I picked up my folder labeled Tax Prep and drove downtown. The attorney's office was on the 12th floor of a neutral glass building. Quiet, understated, efficient. I chose that firm deliberately. No dramatic billboards, no aggressive slogans, just reputation and discretion. When I sat across from her, a woman in her mid-40s with steady eyes, I spoke calmly. "I recently discovered my husband has been maintaining a long-term extramarital relationship," I said. "I have documentation. I'm not here to react. I'm here to understand my options." She didn't gasp. She didn't pity me. She asked structured questions. Length of marriage, shared assets, property ownership, retirement accounts, debt. I answered precisely. For the first time, I said the truth out loud without cushioning it. 3 years, I added, parallel schedule. She nodded slowly. "And does he know that you know?" "No." That word shifted the air. Because knowledge asymmetry is leverage. We discussed strategy. In our state, divorce proceedings could begin without a public spectacle. Financial disclosures would be required. Asset division would consider duration and contribution, both financial and non-financial. "Do you want confrontation first?" she asked. "No," I said evenly. "I want preparation first." She outlined the next steps. Secure copies of all financial documents. Avoid large, suspicious transfers. Do not alert him prematurely. Consider housing arrangements quietly. It felt less like emotional triage and more like project management. When I left her office, I didn't feel broken. I felt structured. Over the next 2 days, while Ethan texted me about networking dinners and early panels, I finalized small but essential actions. I redirected my direct deposit into the separate account I had opened weeks earlier. Not to hide money, but to ensure liquidity once proceedings began. I scheduled a property appraisal under the guise of refinancing research. Routine. Explainable. I gathered certified copies of tax returns and retirement statements. Scanned and stored securely. Every movement was clean, legal, quiet. And because I had always been the one managing logistics, none of it appeared unusual. That was the quiet advantage of being underestimated. He thought my strength was organization. He never considered that the organization could become an exit strategy. On his second night away, he called around 10:15 p.m. "Miss you," he said casually. "I know," I replied gently. There was no accusation in my tone, no hint of exposure, just calm. He described a dinner with colleagues. I listened, aware that somewhere between his sentences, another version of him was likely unfolding. But here's what had changed. I no longer needed to imagine it. I already understood it. And while he was managing 2 schedules, I was consolidating one, mine. By the time he boarded his return flight, the paperwork was prepared for filing. Not submitted yet, but complete. Waiting for my signature. Irreversible, once initiated. The power of moving in silence is this. The other person continues performing the illusion of control, unaware that the foundation has already shifted. When Ethan walked back into our home 3 days later, suitcase rolling behind him, he smiled the same charming smile that had reassured everyone for years. "Everything good here?" he asked. "Yes," I said, and for the first time, that answer belonged entirely to me. Everything was good, because I was no longer reacting. I was executing. The consequences didn't start with shouting. They started with absence. A week after Ethan returned from his conference, I filed. Not publicly, Not theatrically, just formally. The paperwork moved quietly through legal channels. He was served on a Tuesday afternoon at his office. I wasn't there. I was at work, reviewing architectural timelines, when my phone buzzed. Ethan, what is this? I let the message sit for 12 minutes before responding. It's a petition for divorce. 3 dots appeared almost instantly. Is this some kind of joke? No. He called immediately. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice wasn't angry. It was disoriented. Harper, what is going on? I kept my tone level. I've been reviewing our finances and your schedule for a while. Silence. Not denial, not yet. What are you talking about? He asked carefully. I know about the second phone, Ethan. That was the first real consequence. The illusion fractured, not in a dramatic explosion, but in a pause. A long one. You went through my things, he finally said. There it was. Redirection. I didn't have to go far, I replied calmly. He exhaled sharply. This is insane. You're overreacting. I didn't argue. I didn't list details. I didn't say her name. I'm not overreacting, I said. I'm concluding. Another silence. You could have talked to me, he said, voice tightening. We could have worked through this. That sentence fascinated me. Worked through what? 3 years of parallel scheduling? 2 hotel circuits? An entire secondary calendar? Consequences rarely feel fair to the person who didn't expect them. I gave you 12 years, I said quietly. You gave me 3 versions of the truth. He didn't shout. That's important. Ethan wasn't explosive. He was destabilized. By that evening, the shift had begun to ripple outward. His mother called me first. Is everything okay? She asked carefully. Yes, I said, we're separating. What happened? I realized we weren't aligned. I refused to narrate his betrayal for him. I refused to perform humiliation. If he wanted to explain, that was his responsibility. Over the next few days, I watched something subtle unfold. His confidence faltered. He called twice more, softer each time. I made a mistake, he said. It didn't mean anything. 3 years of structured deception reduced to a mistake. That reframing might have worked months ago. Now it sounded small. At work, colleagues who had admired his discipline began asking quiet questions. His mood had shifted. He was distracted. Meetings ran long. Deadlines slipped. When the foundation you relied on vanishes unexpectedly, the rest of the structure trembles. And here's the quiet truth. I had been his foundation. Logistically, emotionally, socially. He had built expansion on top of stability he assumed was permanent. When that stability withdrew, the expansion became unstable. I didn't celebrate that. I observed it. Consequences aren't revenge. They're gravity. And gravity doesn't shout. It simply pulls. One evening, as I sat alone at our dining table, now half cleared of his things, I felt the full weight of what I had done. Not a dramatic triumph, just finality. The house was quieter. My calendar was lighter. And for the first time in years, there were no parallel narratives unfolding behind my back. Just one. Mine. Panic doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like negotiation. 3 days after he was served, Ethan came home early from work. He stood in the kitchen, our kitchen, though it no longer felt shared, the same place where I had once discovered the first hotel charge. He looked tired. Not guilty. Not angry. Unsettled. Can we talk? He asked. We are talking, I said calmly, setting down my mug. He ran a hand through his hair, something he only did when he didn't have a prepared script. I ended it, he said quickly. Immediately. I told her it was a mistake. I blocked the number. This doesn't have to be permanent. There it was again. Framing, as if permanence were the problem, not deception. I studied his face. For the first time in 12 years, I wasn't scanning it for reassurance. I was assessing it for clarity. When were you going to tell me? I asked. He hesitated. I was going to, I just didn't know how. 3 years. 3 holidays. 3 anniversaries. I needed time, he added. You had time, I replied. Silence settled between us, heavier than any argument we'd ever had. He shifted strategies. You're blowing up our entire life over something that could have been fixed. I let that sentence sit in the air. Fixed. As if betrayal were a plumbing issue. As if trust were a cracked tile that could be resealed. What exactly would we be fixing? I asked evenly. Our marriage. Our marriage existed alongside another one, I said. That's not a crack. That's a duplicate foundation. He looked genuinely confused, as if he hadn't considered that his actions redefined the structure entirely. I never stopped loving you, he said softly. I believed him. That was the complicated part. He probably hadn't. But love without exclusivity isn't partnership. It's convenient. He stepped closer. We can go to therapy. We can take a break. We don't have to end this. His voice carried urgency now, not because he feared losing me emotionally, because he hadn't prepared for losing me practically. The house, the finances, the stability, the image. I realized something in that moment that finalized everything inside me. He was trying to restore the structure, not rebuild trust. The panic wasn't about hurting me. It was about losing equilibrium. I don't hate you, I said quietly. He blinked, as if expecting anger. I'm not leaving because I'm furious, I continued. I'm leaving because I'm clear. That sentence seemed to land harder than anything else. Clarity is difficult to argue with. He exhaled sharply. You're being cold. No, I said gently. I'm being consistent. For years, I had been consistent in managing details, smoothing edges, and preserving harmony. Now I was consistent in protecting my dignity. He sat down at the table, in the same chair where I had once mapped out our vacations, our budgets, our future. I didn't think you'd ever, he trailed off. Ever what? I asked. Leave. There it was. The assumption. Not that I wouldn't be hurt. Not that I wouldn't find out. That I wouldn't act. Too late to fix it doesn't mean there was no opportunity. It means the opportunity was spent. Spent on secrecy. Spent on scheduling. Spent on believing I would stay invisible. I picked up my planner from the counter. The same planner he once joked about. The same planner who now held legal timelines instead of dinner reservations. This isn't punishment, I said calmly. It's alignment. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. Not as the steady background presence, but as the architect of my own exit. And in his silence, I understood something fully. He hadn't prepared for this version of me. The final conversation didn't happen in our kitchen. It happened in the attorney's conference room. Neutral walls. Frosted glass. A polished wooden table long enough to create distance without hostility. Ethan sat across from me, legal documents arranged neatly in front of him. For once, he wasn't leading the discussion. He wasn't telling stories. He wasn't reframing the narrative. He was reacting. Our attorneys handled most of the logistics, asset division, timelines, procedural details. I listened carefully, occasionally clarifying a figure or correcting a minor discrepancy. Calmly. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no dramatic unveiling of text messages. The facts were already embedded in the paperwork. At one point, Ethan looked at me directly. Is there really nothing I can say? He asked. It wasn't theatrical. It was sincere. I met his eyes. You could say many things, I replied. But none of them would change what happened. He swallowed slightly. I never meant to hurt you. I know, I said. That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have, because anger invites defense. Understanding removes it. You didn't plan to hurt me, I continued. You planned not to get caught. The room remained quiet. He didn't deny it. The distinction mattered. Pain caused by an accident can sometimes be repaired. Pain sustained through structure requires accountability at a different level. I would have ended it eventually, he said softly. But you didn't, I answered. No heat, just sequence. Eventually is a word people use when they hope time will solve a decision they refuse to make. He leaned back in his chair, the confidence I once admired replaced with something more fragile. I underestimated you, he admitted. There it was. Not cruelty, not malice. Assumption. He had mistaken calm for compliance. Organization for dependency. Loyalty for permanence. I underestimated myself too, I said quietly. That was the only confession I needed to make. Because the truth is, I had allowed the role. I had reinforced it with silence. I had prioritized harmony over alignment. We signed documents that day. Ink on paper. 12 years distilled into signatures. When the meeting ended, our attorneys stepped out to finalize copies. For a moment, we were alone. I did love you, he said. I loved you too, I replied. The past tense landed gently between us. There was no hatred in the room. No dramatic farewell. Just two people acknowledging that the structure they built had been fundamentally incompatible with honesty. As I gathered my planner and stood to leave, he said one last thing. I didn't think you'd ever walk away without a fight. I paused. I didn't walk away without a fight, I said calmly. I fought quietly, and that was the difference. He had built two versions of himself. I had built one version of my exit. No shouting, no humiliation, no spectacle. just a consequence of the meeting structure. As I walked out of the building into the late afternoon light, I felt something unexpected. Not victory, not relief, integration. For the first time in years, there was no parallel narrative unfolding in my life. Only one version of me, whole. It's been a year. I still live in Portland. Different house, smaller kitchen, fewer chairs at the table. The silence here feels different. Before, silence held questions I wasn't asking. Now it holds the space I chose. People often expect bitterness after a story like mine. They look at me carefully, as if scanning for resentment. As if betrayal should permanently harden a person. It didn't harden me. It clarified me. For a while, I examined my own reflection closely. Not physically, but internally. I asked myself uncomfortable questions. Why did I ignore the early signals? Why did I equate stability with success? Why did I allow humor to reframe my strengths as flaws? The answers weren't dramatic. I valued harmony. I believed loyalty meant endurance. I trusted that love, once established, wouldn't require verification. None of those values is wrong. But without boundaries, they become liabilities. The biggest shift wasn't leaving Ethan. It was redefining strength. I used to think strength meant carrying weight quietly, absorbing tension so others could remain comfortable. Being the reliable one, no matter what. Now, strength means alignment. If something feels misaligned, I address it early, calmly, directly. Not with accusation, but with clarity. I still use my planner. It no longer tracks someone else's parallel life. It tracks my own commitments, work projects I chose, trips I booked for myself, and financial goals I set intentionally. Financial independence isn't new to me. I always managed our money, but now it feels different. It's not shared leverage. It's personal autonomy. Sometimes people ask if I miss him. I miss who I thought he was. I don't miss who he proved himself to be. There's a difference. I've dated cautiously since the divorce. Not from fear, but from awareness. I asked questions earlier. I observe consistency. I don't shrink my instincts to preserve comfort. And perhaps most importantly, I no longer fear being perceived as too much. If asking for clarity unsettles someone, that tells me more than reassurance ever could. What changed most wasn't my marital status. It was my tolerance for narrative distortion. I don't allow subtle reframing anymore. If someone jokes about my attention to detail, I smile and say, yes, that's one of my strengths. No apology, no softening. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about self-trust. I used to think being underestimated was harmless. Now I see it differently. Being underestimated gives you two choices. Shrink into it, or redefine yourself without asking permission. I chose the second. There's a calm that comes from living in one coherent story. No parallel schedules, no hidden compartments, no rehearsed explanations. Just integrity. And the woman I am now isn't louder than before. She's simply unwilling to disappear. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Betrayal rarely begins with a grand revelation. It begins with small distortions. A joke that reframes your strength. A detail that doesn't quite align. A moment where your intuition whispers, and you silence it to keep the peace. I didn't lose my marriage the day I found the second phone. I lost it slowly in every moment. I chose harmony over clarity. And here's what I've learned. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Patience doesn't mean blind. And love doesn't mean indefinite tolerance. When I discovered my husband had been living a double life for years, right under my roof, I thought the most painful part would be the deception. It wasn't. The most painful part was realizing how long I had doubted myself to preserve a version of him that didn't exist. 2 phones, 2 schedules, 2 versions of the same man, but there was only ever one version of me. And the moment I stopped shrinking that version to fit someone else's architecture, everything changed. I didn't destroy his life. I stepped out of it. I didn't humiliate him. I stopped protecting a narrative that excluded me. There's power in loud justice. But there's a different kind of power in quiet departure. In documentation instead of accusation. In preparation instead of panic. In choosing dignity over spectacle. If you're listening to this and something in your life feels slightly misaligned, if someone has gently, repeatedly made you question your own perception, pause. Not to accuse, not to react, but to observe. Ask yourself, Are you being loved in full truth or managed in partial truth? I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever ignored your intuition to preserve peace? And what did it cost you in the end?